Now, last week we looked at a very important political crisis in the life of ancient Israel. And we learned from that crisis that autocratic power does not solve the problems that face a society. Now we're going to continue to kind of learn that lesson this morning, but we're going to layer on top of that lesson a new lesson about political expediency, about doing what seems to make sense even if it isn't the most moral or thing in the world. And on top of that, we're going to layer another political crisis as well. But before we get started with all of that, we need to kind of bring ourselves up to speed to where we're at. Okay? Now, we are something on the order of 120 years, or maybe even more, after the first political crisis, the one we looked at last week, where Israel asks for a king. Israel has gone through 3 kings now, and they're on their 4th king. How has the monarchy worked? What are the results of this change in government? Well, we wouldn't be honest if we didn't admit that there were some positive results. Israel seems to have had more military effectiveness, largely due to David's seeming genius for warfare and his courage. And there was an increase in national wealth, largely due to David's conquests and Solomon's ability to leverage those conquests for the enrichment of the nation. But there were also negative results. There were 2 destructive civil wars. One during the reign, or actually after the reign of Saul, and one during the reign of David. There was a regionally oriented rebellion. Now see, this is a part of the story that people often miss. It's right after that terrible civil war between David and Absalom. But there is this regionally oriented rebellion where you have the people of the northern kingdom saying the very same thing that Natalia just read here. Hey, what part do we have in David? Why should we care about David? Right? He's not one of us. And if you know your biblical history, you know that there's always been this rivalry between the tribes, or half-tribes we might call them, that come under Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, on the one hand, and Judah on the other. Okay? Well, that is expressed in this regionally affiliated rebellion right after David's civil war with Absalom. We also see significant royal family corruption. The rape of Tamar by Amnon is one example, but there were probably more where that came from. And hopefully not that severe, but it's evidence that there was something rotten in the royal family. And then there is the consequence that Samuel predicted would happen. And this is the one we really want to focus on because it's the foundation for the crisis we want to address this morning. A bureaucracy had arisen. an oppressive bureaucracy. Now, that bureaucracy certainly was begun by Saul. It was built on rather significantly by David, but Solomon is the one who perfected it. And yes, it enriched the nation, but by the nation we mainly mean the king. And it is that bureaucracy and its impact on people's lives that is the background for this morning's story. So what's going on here? Let's sketch the outlines of this new political crisis. Okay? What's happening here? Well, look up there in 1 Kings 12, verse 1. Okay? What's happening here? Well, King Rehoboam is leaving Jerusalem, and his capital, the capital that David established, and he's going to Shechem, this site that is so important to Israelite history and identity. And what he's doing there is he's going to have his kingship affirmed by what we would call the National Assembly. That's what's happening here. Now, Rehoboam probably thinks this is just a rubber stamp event, right? But what he does not recognize is this overlapping of systems of government, which in and of itself represents an overlapping of ideologies, an overlapping of different priorities and perspectives about how Hebrew identity is to be constructed, about how the Hebrew nation is supposed to work. So Rehoboam gets there, and before the assembly affirms him as king, they ask a question. That's what's going on in, the first 15 verses or so of this chapter. They ask him this question. Hey, look, your father, Solomon, built this oppressive, burdensome bureaucracy. Could you give us some relief? Sounds like a very reasonable request, right? The problem is that this request is not, from the very outset, is not innocuous. Notice, they present the request before they affirm Rehoboam as king. Listen to that subtext. The subtext is, we might not approve your kingship if you don't do what we say. Now, you can only imagine that what we have here is a surprised king. This is not how things were done in the ancient Near East. Remember, we are 2,000 years before the Magna Carta. Okay? The Magna Carta, remember, that's that charter that limits the authority of the king under English law. Right? It's the first limits placed on an English monarch. We're 2,000 years before that. Now, so this is a surprise. And nobody wants a surprised king. That's always bad. But then you've got something else going on here too. An old enemy has showed up to the party. A guy named Jeroboam. A guy who Solomon wanted to kill. Why? Because he's also a guy that a prophet went to and said, you will be king over the northern tribes. Jeroboam clearly has standing among at least some of these northern tribes, and he has no incentive to make peace with Rehoboam. So that's the situation that Rehoboam finds himself in. And so he begins to ask for advice. He tells the people, go away for 3 days, let me think about this. And he asks for advice. Now, when I have heard this text taught, okay, and in fact, when I have taught it myself, I have heard this text taught, and I have taught it as if you've got the wise old men and the stupid young men. And at one level, that seems to be how the text wants you to read it. The Bible always has a bias towards the old. The problem is, actually, both of them are wise. And both of them are making a very important point. In fact, so important, they may not have even realized how important it was. So let's look at the old men first, because we know that their advice is wise. What do they say? What do they tell the king? Well, look, if you will capitulate on this part, they'll vote you in. You'll be king. They'll serve you forever. It'll be fine. Just do what they want in this one instance, and you'll be all right. Okay? That's their argument. What is it that they see? They see the immediate threat. You can't be king 20 years from now if they don't vote you in now. Right? That's how this works. The whole point of having this affirmational assembly is so that the king can come back later and say, hey, look, you said that you would be loyal. This is a different kind of culture than our own. You're not in this culture allowed to change your mind once you've made a promise. The older men understand that. I think the older men also understand that while Solomon's policies may have been good for the state, it wasn't good for people. But the young men understand something too. They understand what I've called here the long-term threat. And it's simply this. If you, as the king, allow the National Assembly to hold your kingship hostage, no matter what the reason, you are no longer the final authority. They are. They become the ultimate authority. That's what the young men understand. They understand that if you give, this is the ancient Near East, everybody likes power. If you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. And eventually, you will be king in name only, or not at all. That's the argument that they're making. And that is the argument that ultimately wins the day. Now, you may wonder, well, maybe it's better to be not king, to be king in name only than to not be king at all. That's a fair question. We're going to have to come back to that one. But Rehoboam makes his decision. Now, there's a couple of things missing from his decision. One of them is any sort of political imagination. That's what we talked about last week, right? There's no political imagination. There's no sense of the king kind of reframing his own role. But I think one of the reasons there's no political imagination is because there's something else lacking. A sense of moral obligation to the people. Or you could say, even to God. After all, the land, if you really read the Old Testament carefully, the land does not belong to the people of Israel, it belongs to God. And they're just leasing it from Him, in a sense. Moreover, the people of Israel themselves belong to God. So if you are the king, you're already only the king in name only, okay? You see, the whole architecture of Israelite identity, religion, theology just doesn't fit with kingship. But if you're going to have a king, that king has to have a deep and profound sense of moral obligation, both to God and to the people. And that's basically what David had. He wasn't perfect in it, but he understood this sense of obligation. Sometimes 1st and 2nd Samuel even use this word, chesed, that Hebrew word that talks about loyalty and commitment and compassion and kindness and goodness. All those great virtues rolled into that one word. It will use that word to describe this sense of obligation that David felt towards the people as a whole, or towards a particular person in his army, or to a particular person in his administration, right? David understood, I should say, his obligations. Rehoboam doesn't see it that way. He does not see his kingship through that lens. And because he does not see his kingship through that lens, it drastically alters the way that he relates to people. It's so, I don't know, it just makes you shake your head. So Rehoboam gets this rebuke from the National Assembly. And instead of sending out, I don't know, maybe his chief advisor or somebody to reason with the crowd, he sends out the director of forced labor. What? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's just, how could you even possibly think that was a good idea? So of course what happens? The people grab him and they stone him to death. It is a form of punitive execution. They are communicating to the king, A, we reject your authority categorically, and B, we hold you accountable for the deaths of our brothers and sisters, our fathers and mothers, our sons and our daughters. How can you be that politically tone deaf? Well, Rehoboam is how. That's all I can say. But now we have a new king in the northern kingdom. His name's Jeroboam. He's the old enemy of Solomon, right? And Jeroboam is the opposite of Rehoboam. And this is where we run into the problem we want to talk about this morning. The problem of political expediency. Now, what is political expediency? What do I mean when I use that term? Well, expediency is a word that we use when we want to talk about a course of action or a quality of a person, something like that, that is practically beneficial, but is morally or theoretically or something like that questionable for some reason. Okay? So, practically beneficial, but maybe not necessarily on the up and up. Jeroboam was the master of political expediency, but he wasn't the first, okay? In fact, that's part of what got Saul deposed as king. He would do things out of political expediency. So, for example, remember Saul's king of Israel and he's fighting this war, and Samuel says, hey, I'm going to meet you at, I think it was Gilgal, in fact, on such and such day. Do not offer the sacrifices till I get there. I will offer the sacrifices. Well, what does Saul do? Samuel's late, and Saul's worried about his army scattering, and so he offers the sacrifices. Well, as soon as the first sacrifice is slaughtered, here comes Samuel. And he's mad, right? Why? Because Saul didn't obey what God told him to do through the prophet. He did what he thought was in his best interest at the time. Another time that it happens in Saul's life is when Saul is fighting this war against the Amalekites, and God has said, I want you to wipe them out, completely destroy them. But Saul chooses not to do that. One, because he wants his soldiers to get some pay for their warfare, and two, probably because Agag, the king, is a fellow king like him. Well, of course, then Samuel shows up and is like, I told you. And Saul's making excuses again. But what about David? Well, David, most of the time, didn't do this, but he did do it at least once. Remember that whole weird story towards the end of 2 Samuel where David wants to do a census? And Joab, who was about the most unscrupulous person you would ever meet, for once in his life he gets some scruples and says, no, you don't need to do this. You really, 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 really don't need to do this. And finally David makes him go do it. And then, of course, there is Solomon and his harem. Now, we tend to think of Solomon's harem as a reflection of his inordinate affection for girls. And it was certainly that, you know. But it was also politically strategic. Here's what you do. You go, you marry somebody from another country, one of your surrounding countries. Well, by marrying that person, you've made an alliance with that country. And so now, if you've got wives and concubines from all the countries surrounding you, maybe even from some far away, now you've got all these alliances. You're supposed to be protected. Guess what? It didn't always work. Jeroboam, what happened? When Solomon got mad at him, he fled to Egypt. Well, one of Solomon's wives was from Egypt. Why didn't the Egyptians just hand Jeroboam over to Solomon? Because something in that alliance had gotten broken. By the way, both the Bible and Egyptian records tell us about the results of that broken alliance. It resulted in Emperor Shishak or Pharaoh Shishak, I should say, of Egypt invading Judah. Now, the Bible says that it happened after Solomon's death. Egyptian records seem to imply that it happened before Solomon's death. But whatever the case was, it was right around the time of the transition of the kingdom. So see, that bit of political expediency didn't work, did it? But Jeroboam is the master of political expediency. He's the master of doing what would seem to make sense. But let's understand why he did this, okay? And what this I'm talking about is. Look down there in verses 21 through the end of the chapter, okay? So you've got this northern kingdom and this southern kingdom. Later they'll be referred to as Samaria and Judah, okay? And Samaria doesn't exist as a capital yet. It hasn't been built, but we'll just use those names to make sure we understand who we're talking about. Jeroboam is now the king of Samaria, of the northern kingdom. And he's got this territory, and he's got these tribes, he's got all these people. He's got to get his government together, but he's also got to do something else. He's got to protect himself from Rehoboam. Because Rehoboam wants to have the whole kingdom back. In fact, a prophet has to intervene to keep Rehoboam from invading Samaria immediately with 180,000 troops, right? So, Jeroboam is sitting around in his house thinking, about what all kings think about. How do I stay in power? And he realizes, wait a minute, I've got one huge problem. Every year, these people in my kingdom go up to Jerusalem to worship. They do this every year. And they're worshiping at a temple built by Solomon, my old enemy. One of these days, he thinks to himself, they're going to turn around and betray me to Rehoboam. That's Jeroboam's conundrum. What does he do? And remember, in the ancient Near East, they don't have this idea of separation of church and state. Okay? That's not even on their radar. So, you got Jeroboam here kind of going, oh boy, this looks like the end of my kingdom. He's still not thinking about what the prophet told him. He's still not trusting fully what the prophet said and who the source is of his success. So what does Jeroboam do? How does he fix this problem? Well, Jeroboam's answer is to put a golden calf at 2 locations in his territory. Now let me ask you something. Does that sound familiar to you? Exactly. Exodus 31, 32. The people are down in the valley. Moses is up on the mountain. They're getting antsy because Moses hasn't come back yet. And they tell Aaron, hey, why don't you make us a golden calf to worship? Jeroboam does the very same thing, except he doesn't make one, he makes 2. That way people don't have to go very far, or as far anyway, to go worship. Now, this act of political expediency may not have seemed that bad to Jeroboam, but it was a crushing defeat for Israelite identity. Idolatry began to proliferate in every aspect of Israelite society. And as idolatry proliferated, as people started worshiping more and more and more gods from the peoples around them, by the way, this had happened before, so this was something that Jeroboam should have been worried about, but he wasn't. The more that this idolatry proliferated, the more that it fundamentally changed Israelite identity. The more that the northern kingdom in particular, the more that Samaria became associated with this polytheism that was all around them, with this idolatry that is all around them. And you'll remember what I taught you, gosh, it's been 3 years ago now, or almost 3 years ago now, when we started talking about idolatry, okay? Idolatry is a problem not just because you're worshiping the wrong God, but also because you're worshiping the wrong kind of God. You have reshaped God in the image of your needs rather than allowed God to be who He truly is. Okay? And as they reshape Israelite identity, they're also reshaping the state, the Israelite state. Samaria will become essentially just like all the other kingdoms of the ancient Near East. Where have we heard that phrase before? 1 Samuel 8, right? No, but give us a king so that we can be like all the nations around us. Well, now they're becoming like all the nations around them, where the power of the palace is merged with the power of the priesthood. What is Jeroboam doing? Jeroboam himself, the king, is appointing priests. Now the text makes a big deal out of the fact that he's appointing priests from all over the place, from every tribe, from whoever wants to be one, right? Well, that's bad. But I would submit to you that the real problem is that Jeroboam is appointing priests. Jeroboam is not a priest. He doesn't get to do that. You see, even when the monarchy was established, and Deuteronomy basically tells the people of Israel that one day there would be a monarchy, even though that was not their form of government at the time. Even when the monarchy was established, there was still a balance of powers. You had the king, but then you had the priests, and then you had the prophets. And they're all different. They all have different roles in shepherding the people of Israel. But now, Jeroboam's taking those roles and merging them into one so that he can have more power, so that he can have more control, so that he can protect himself. And here's the scary part. That sin of Jeroboam ends up spreading to the southern kingdom too. Judah follows suit. Now eventually, King Jehoshaphat in the south will get rid of a lot of this. But the truth is, he never, in fact, none of the Jewish kings, even the great Josiah, never fully uproot. None of the kings, not Hezekiah, not Josiah, not Jehoshaphat, not Asa, none of them are ever able to truly uproot this sin of Jeroboam once it gets started. It never fully goes away. Jeroboam's act of political expediency may have made sense to him at the time, but it had disastrous results for the nation. It's not surprising that basically not long after Jeroboam's death, everybody in his family was killed by the next potentate who came to the throne and tried to turn the kingdom of Samaria into this great ancient Near Eastern monarchical power. Now, how do we take this and apply it to our situation? Because our situation is different, right? I mean, well, that's what we want to talk about here as we conclude. How do we make this applicable to our situation? Look, any government that is high in self-determination, in other words, a democracy like ours, is going to require a lot of deliberation and sometimes some compromise in order for things to get done. That's just how it is. You're not going to get rid of all the people that you think are crazy from California. They're still, California is not, I have bad news for you. California is not going to fall off the edge of the United States. Not going to happen. Just like if I were preaching to a bunch of California liberals, I would say, you're not getting rid of Texas. You're not giving it back to Mexico. There's too much oil there. It's not going. Not going to happen. We have to learn how to live with each other, right? So there's going to be some give and take, and you're going to make some practical decisions sometimes. You're going to look at the practicalities of something and realize, okay, this makes the most sense to do in this situation on this issue. But that's different than worshiping at the altar of political expediency. That's different than making what is best for me, what is best for my kind of people, what is best for those who will support my agenda, the highest good, right? So that's one thing that we have to recognize, is that We can't make an idol out of political expediency itself. But here's the real issue, okay? A lot of times we do that, especially in a democracy, because we think we can control the outcome of our political actions. Well, as Justin Giboney, the great Atlanta area minister and lawyer, has recently observed, guess what? You can't. History has some strange turns to it. And, sometimes we talk about the law of unintended consequences. You don't know what those are going to be. Moreover, C.S. Lewis argued, it's not even your job to control the consequences of your political actions. What's your job? Well, according to Giboney and Lewis both, your job is to be faithful. I think as we read this text, we would have to say that they're right. Now, what does being faithful mean? What does that mean? Well, it means three things. It means remembering who you are, both as a Christian and as an American. For us, particularly in America, I really think both of those have value. Both of those are important. Yes, sometimes they stand in tension with each other, but they're both important. All right? It means remembering who you are, never giving that up. It also means remembering your values, even in the midst of disagreement, maybe especially in the midst of disagreement. I remember just a few weeks ago, I was talking with a couple of you about one of your children disagreeing with you, and how she was afraid that you would be angry with her and maybe kick her out or whatever if she disagreed with you. And you handled it so much like a Christian is supposed to handle things. Oh, first of all, we're your parents first, okay? Now, we're going to tell you when we disagree with you, but we're always going to love you. Well, that's the approach that we kind of have to take in every area of our lives. By the way, not just politically. We're being faithful to who we are as Christians, no matter what the context is. We're being faithful to who we are as Americans, no matter what the context is. Now, that's not always easy, okay? That's not always easy. I get that. Sometimes we don't even know what that means in a particular situation. Believe me, I'm not going to throw you under the bus for that, okay? If you're not quite sure, I'm certainly not sure sometimes, and I certainly do not always get it right. But this is the goal. We don't sacrifice our values in order to accomplish some ephemeral political good, not knowing what the consequences are going to be. Okay? And by the way, we don't know what the consequences are going to be. And then the third way that we're faithful is that we live faithful to our values also in our political life, not in our non-political life, not just in terms of our agenda politically, but also just in how we live our lives. So in other words, I'll give an example from sort of both sides of the aisle here. It's not enough to simply vote against abortion. Do you actually volunteer with the Crisis Pregnancy Center? Does your church actually help unwed mothers? How do you treat young women in particular who show up to your congregation pregnant and, don't know where to go from here? Or for example, let's say that you're someone who cares deeply about immigrant policy, about immigrant rights, and you feel like America has been too hard on those who have immigrated here. Well, okay, it's one thing to advocate politically, but do you give your time and your money and your effort to help those who are in need? The people who actually, in Baptist circles, we call that practicing what you preach, right? The people who I respect the most are like, I just heard this week about a Hispanic pastor in West Texas. Yeah, he's a Trump voter, but he's also feeding hundreds of immigrants through his church every week. That's a guy I can respect, right? Or, the women mostly, but also men who work in crisis pregnancy centers every day, working with women who very often come in and are scared to death, not just because they're pregnant, but because they have no idea how their partner is going to react. Or worse, they do know how their partner is going to react. And they work with these women every day, loving them, caring for them, carrying them through some of the hardest times in life. And, by the way, they set up systems to help these women. It's practicing what you preach. I mean, it's so funny. You can walk in there. It doesn't matter. You can walk in there with a wedding ring on your finger and everything looks fine. But I'm going to tell you right now, you walk into a crisis pregnancy center, even if it's just to get, a pregnancy test, they're going to take your wife back and make sure that you're not abusing her. And if you are, they've got a police officer at the back door who will escort her away and then escort you to jail. Right? That's what we do. We live consistent with our values even when nobody from Fox News or MSNBC is watching. Right? That's what we're talking about here. But notice this last point that I've put on the screen for you. This is the most important. Because regardless of where we end up landing on this question of political expediency, all of us can be corrupted by sin and idolatry. It can happen to us in our private lives, but guess what? It can happen to us in our public lives too. It can happen to us in our political lives. Now, look, if you're sitting there thinking, man, this is all very interesting, but it feels so vague, it feels so non-specific. Unfortunately, that's how this works. We dive deep into the stories of Scripture, and then we come up on the other side looking around going, okay, Holy Spirit, I need you to show me how this is all going to work, how this is all going to apply to my life. And He will. But it's going to take time, it's going to take discernment, it's going to take prayer, and it's going to take us, the people of God, standing together, loving each other in the meantime, until we come to that place where God wants us to be. But we have to choose to make this our agenda. Faithfulness our agenda, not sin and idolatry and political expedience. By the way, that's where our resorting to autocratic power often comes from anyway. It comes from a heart of idolatry and a fear of what would actually happen if God was in control instead of us. Let's not live in that fear. Let's live in faith that God knows what He's doing, and that even when it doesn't look like He knows what He's doing to us, we can trust Him. Let's pray.